Good morning. Today is August 7th, 2025, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler, David Shraga, and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everyone who negotiates. There's no charge for these great presentations. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And wow, our audiences have been so generous since we began the series in the spring of 2020. One of my favorite parts of the webinar each week is when we announce the running total of just how much our audiences have contributed. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
Oh, with pleasure. And it's exciting to be here. The number now is $856,657.87. Every penny counts. So thank you all so much for your generosity. Thank you to our speakers, including many of you, and onward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. And I know that some people may be motivated to make a little extra contribution to their local food bank today in honor of you, because today is your birthday, my friend, and I know everybody online joins me in wishing you a very happy birthday. Please put your happy birthday wishes to Jean in the comments. We won't put any of you on the spot by asking you to sing to her. Nonetheless, Jean, happy birthday to you.
Wow.
And
Thank you very much.
yeah. And now on with the show. It's a Hollywood show today. The Deal Behind the Deal. Hollywood negotiation secrets from the trenches. Our very own David Shraga is presenting today. He's going to offer an insider's look at the hidden dynamics of entertainment deal making, where every contract is a delicate balance of ego, leverage, and creative control. David will provide an overview of the complex landscape and ecosystem of deal makers and how the key players navigate negotiations over the life cycle of an entertainment project. Within this framework, David reveals the sophisticated psychological and strategic techniques he has developed in Hollywood's pressure cooker environment and how those techniques translate directly to high-stakes mediation and complex business negotiations. You all know David as very well-dressed co-host of our programs every Thursday morning. What you may not know is that he has been a practicing lawyer and studio executive in LA for over 20 years. He offers a unique insider's perspective on the entertainment industry as an entertainment and intellectual property litigator, in-house deal maker, and also now as a private mediator. He is the Senior Vice President and Head of Global Television Business and Legal Affairs at Miramax, where he oversees all deal negotiations that related to the studio's domestic and international productions and licensing deals. Before that, he was Vice President of Business and Legal Affairs for Universal International Studios, where he advised prominent producers like Working Title Television, Carnival Films, and Heyday Television, and handled deals in the UK, Canada, Australia, and beyond. David has also served as a senior counsel for legal affairs for Universal Pictures, where he worked on all aspects of the film studio's production. David attended college at Yale and USC Law School. He practiced for a while at the same law firm where I practiced, Al Schuler. It was called Al Schuler, Grossman and Pines when I was there, Al Schuler, Grossman, Stein and Kahn when David was there. Then he founded his own law firm and then went in-house. He's entrepreneurial, he's intellectual, he's fantastic in every way. We love having him as part of the Will Work for Food team. David, please tell us a little bit about the food bank where you'd like people to direct contributions if they're able to contribute. And then, as you say in Hollywood, on with the show. The floor is yours.
Right, Jeff, thank you so much for that gracious and warm introduction. I have to say that it's really been my privilege to be part of this program with you and Jean and Natalie for, I think, some 6 months now. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this community. You know, I recognize so many of the faces week in and week out, and I'm just inspired by your generosity, your participation, and have really just found it to be rewarding to learn from these programs and from all of you as well. So thank you very much. The food bank I've designated today is called SOVA. It's part of the Jewish Family Services here in Los Angeles. And, you know, like so many, obviously, other religious organizations that do charitable work, they support everyone across the spectrum. And my relationship to SOVA comes through my young son who was going to preschool at the local JCC. And in the lobby of the JCC, they have a giant bin for SOVA contributions. And every Friday, we're encouraged to uh, bring something in and make a contribution to the food bank. And it's been a great way for us to talk with our young one about charity, about being gracious for what we have and or grateful for what we have, and for help, and to teach them to help others as well. So it's a great organization, and any contributions, I'm sure they would appreciate. Okay, so before I start, I want to acknowledge the help I received in preparing these slides from my colleague Oliver Baroud, who I see is with us on the program today. Oliver is our ACE intern, a student at Berkeley College back in Boston. He's been with us this summer, making a great contribution to our Business and Legal Affairs department, and I couldn't have done this without him. So thank you very much, Oliver, for your help. You know, today I'm going to talk about what it means to work in business and legal affairs within a studio and try and provide you with an overview of how the business works. Um, in my view, that means talking about who the players are when it comes to making deals, how the ecosystem of repeat business functions between everybody who's involved in making these deals. And I'm going to try and do it by sharing some stories that will hopefully help illustrate some of the points we're trying to make. And hopefully what I can demonstrate today is it's something I've noticed more and more as I've sort of done more work as a mediator, is that I think many of the skills and techniques that we use in business affairs to negotiate deals within the studios are really applicable to mediations, and there are a lot of parallels to what we do in mediations to bring parties together and to settle cases. And I think you'll probably recognize a lot of the skills that many of you utilize yourselves. So, okay. So, you know, I think for me, this cartoon, I think, demonstrates what a lot of people think that making deals in the entertainment business is like, and there is definitely a kernel of truth in that. I like this slide because the guy's name is Dave, and he's wearing a bad suit, so I think there's a bit of an autobiographical element. But look, the reality is that it is fundamentally a relationship business. There are maybe 5 major agencies that handle the vast majority of talent. And there are other ones that are out there, and you come across lots of other folks. But for the most part, most of the talent is handled by the same key agencies and key players. And there's been a real consolidation in terms of how many agencies are out there. Uh, at the same time, there's maybe 10, a dozen law firms, entertainment transactional law firms, that also represent the vast majority of talent that's out there. And then you know, there are only so many studios and platforms that are developing and buying shows as well. So it really becomes a small pond where there's a lot of repeat business, and you find yourself coming in contact with the same folks over and over again on different deals relating to different projects and different clients. And so, not unlike litigation, you know, we talk about civility and what we do, and there's certainly a perception of the schmoozing and the hard-edged deal making, and those elements are definitely there when it comes to being tough sometimes. But the reality is that to be the most effective in this business, I think it's important to really focus on the relationships. Uh, and so, you know, we think about it in terms of the long-term considerations and the short-term considerations. And, you know, one thing that I think is always important to keep in mind is the big picture. So, you know, you may be in the middle of negotiating an individual deal on a project with an agent or an entertainment lawyer, or it might even be with a counterpart who's, you know, working at Netflix if you work at a studio, or working at some different platform. But the reality is you always have to keep in mind the big picture and what battles to fight, and the fact that you all are going to be working together again. So there's a couple of stories resonate with me when I was a young lawyer working in legal affairs. Um, in my first job, when I was working at Universal Pictures, I had gone through the interview process and met with the department head and some other folks on the team. And the last interview was with the person who was the president of the studio, just sort of to make sure that, that he had met you and hopefully that he agreed that you were a normal person who could handle the job. Um, and I remember sitting there with him and saying to him, and asking a question and saying, let's just say you're sitting across the table at a dinner with your counterpart from another major studio, and you're talking about, you're a lawyer in the legal affairs department, or you're a negotiator, that person who runs the department, or the people who are on the team, and you're saying to them, I love my lawyer because blank. What is it? What is it that you want to be able to say about somebody who's negotiating these deals for you, uh, to demonstrate that they're doing a great job for you? And he paused for a second and he said, first thing is that they got the deal done, that they protected the studio's interest, and most importantly, that they preserved the relationship, right? Because by the time something comes to you as the negotiator in a studio, it's gone through the hands of creative executives and agents and all sorts of other folks who are involved in the process of putting together a project, and you're then asked to come in and make the deal. But there is a bigger relationship that's at issue, and it always has to be kept in mind. And we'll talk about all these other parties as we move along in the slides. Another story that resonated with me about preserving relationships and making deals in Hollywood was a story one of my old colleagues in business affairs had said to me, what do you do if it becomes clear early on in negotiating a deal that the gap is just too great to close the deal, and you're not going to be able to get there together with your counterpart? And I paused at the time, and I didn't know the answer, quite frankly. And I asked what? And he said to me, you get out as quickly as you can and you preserve the relationship. Okay. The last thing you want to do is be dragging someone through a negotiation, spending a lot of time building up everyone's hopes and expectations, and then getting to a point where you can't get it done. Now that will happen, and you can come to a point where certain issues just can't be resolved and you have to part ways. But even then, you part ways amicably and you say, look, sorry, we weren't able to get it done this time. We just had these certain limitations. We understand where you're coming from, and we'll do our best for you on the next one. Um, what you don't want to see happen in these negotiations is be in a situation where the relationship is declining between you and your counterpart. The deal is not getting done. People are getting frustrated, and the agent on the other side of the deal calls around and calls, the president of the studio, or calls your boss and says, why isn't this happening? What's the problem, right? You don't want to be in a situation where that's coming back to you. And at a minimum, if there are situations like that, it's so important to be managing expectations so everybody understands where we're headed and what the potential problems might be. So, you know, big picture wise, and this is the same when it comes to, everyone else's deal making. You never forget someone who burned you, or who broke your trust, or who used you as a stalking horse and wasn't transparent with you about what was going on. Right? You never want to be in a position where you're embarrassing someone on the other side. These people have clients, right? They don't want to lose their clients over deals. They don't want to be made to look bad. You always have to give someone a way out and treat the situation respectfully. And I think this is a lot like, negotiating a settlement in a mediation where the parties are going to continue to have an ongoing business relationship, right? You have to do it in a way where they feel respected, the relationship is maintained, and they can move forward in a trust with trust. So kind of going back to this ecosystem, these are really the key players who we are dealing with all the time. And within the studio and within my role, I'm in business affairs for a studio. There are platforms out there that we'll talk more about that are actually the distributors of the content. The talent is all the artists that we'll talk about. The representatives are the agents, the managers, the lawyers. We'll get into that. And then of course there are the guilds. And when when you think about an ecosystem, some various images might come to mind. You can almost imagine Richard Attenborough's voice narrating Planet Earth or something like that, right? And here we've got the great white shark and the seals trying to get past them and getting grabbed out of the water. And maybe to some degree, this is an image of an agent, right, or talent, and people sort of trying to fight to get fed, to find their clients, right, and to grab deals. There's scarce resources out there, and you've got a couple bucks bashing horns. A lot of times studios are competing really aggressively for talent and for projects and to bring in the best people so that they can have a competitive advantage. These penguins, I mean, the studio is a home for lots of artists, and you have to sort of find your place. And there are many different projects, and you have your little piece of the world that you're cultivating, but you're part of a bigger community of folks who are working there. And then, of course, there's the mama lion, the protective agent who's taking care of their cub, or the lawyer who's taking care of the artist, or maybe it's just a senior executive who's taking care of the junior executives and other people on the team. Um, Maybe I took the metaphor too far, but what I like to think really sort of represents this most elegantly is this notion of the murmuration of starlings, right? And you have all these different folks who are involved in the process, who are interacting with each other constantly. It's a beautiful dance that happens sort of without a choreographer in many senses. There's a delicate balance at play, and within the industry, there's competition, there's cooperation, there's nurturing. Like I said, there's this fight for resources, but everyone has their own role to play. They all have different financial incentives. But in general, the idea is that everybody wants to be moving forward together in the same direction, right? To have a cooperative situation where they can make something and everyone can make money. So, people often sort of say, what is it that you actually do within business affairs at a studio? Uh, People think that it's really just negotiating the top level deal terms. So some creative executive comes to you and says, I want to hire a writer. And so you need to negotiate the script fee, the episodic producing fee, their royalty, their back end participation, their credit, their exclusivities, some of the key terms that filter through all these deals. And there's different key terms for a writer deal versus a director deal versus a performer's deal. And, in this presentation today, we're not going to really get into the specifics of all those individual deals, that you could spend an hour on each of those very easily. But big picture wise, what I want us to think about is again, this ecosystem. And within business affairs, you're negotiating all those terms. You're negotiating over the double wide trailer and whether or not the trainer is going to travel with them and the nanny and how many plane tickets they're going to get. In some sense, that's the easy part of the job. My old boss used to use this metaphor of a wheel with spokes and a hub to describe what business affairs does within a studio. And the idea here is that the spokes of the wheel are all these stakeholders who are coming in and offering input regarding different aspects of the process, right? And we'll talk about those stakeholders from the studio perspective inside the studio, but also externally in terms of all the third parties you're dealing with. They're the inputs leading into the hub. And at the hub is business affairs, who is basically taking in all this information, understanding the positions, the demands, asking the questions, gathering the information, like I mentioned, figuring out what the problem or the issue is, identifying what the goals are, figuring out the priorities, and then sort of taking all this information, coming up with the various options you can then present to the internal stakeholders to try and come up with a resolution and a solution, and then going back to the other side and trying to get them to come on board and agree with you. So, you're balancing competing interests, you're assimilating information, and I think in this way, again, I think this is very similar to what mediators do when they're trying to settle cases. Within mediation, we talk about identifying the interests behind the positions, right? An agent might be telling you one thing about what they need or what they want, but there really might be something else going on that you're trying to understand. And there might be a solution to get them what they want that differs from what they asked for, right? So I think it's an elegant metaphor to describe what business affairs does within the studios. So sort of from a big picture perspective, as a business affairs executive, who are you working for in the negotiation ecosystem? Well, the two main players are the studios and the platforms. Okay. And within this construct, it breaks down in a couple of different ways. The main idea again is that the studio is the business that is developing, producing, and selling the project to a distributor, right? And on the other side of that equation is the platform that is then pushing it out and distributing it to all the adoring fans in the world, right? And so historically, there was a limited number of studios and platforms out there, right? There was NBC and ABC and CBS, and they had their own affiliated studios. And then they had their affiliated networks that they then sold their shows to. And then there were some independents that were out there also, like Sony and some others that were producing shows that they were selling to these platforms. There's been a real shift in the industry over the last 40 years or so. These studios and these platforms used to be separate. There were rules in the 80s called the FinCEN rules that required that the same company couldn't own both of these pieces of the ecosystem. Those rules changed in the 90s. And so now what you have is a company like NBC Universal, where I worked, where there are multiple in-house studios that are producing television series or producing films. And then at the same time, that company also owns the means of distribution. So they own the NBC network. They also own Peacock. They have an interest in Sky outside of the United States. And so it really leads to some interesting situations because you might be working within the broader NBC Universal ecosystem. And I used to work for the studio on the television side, and we would develop shows. But sometimes I was selling a show to Peacock, and I would have a counterpart within the same company, but in a different business division, who I was negotiating against to try and get the best price for the show, and they were pushing back and trying to get the best price for the platform, right? So this model, it recreates itself. At Paramount, they have similar dynamics between CBS and their internal studios. Disney, obviously, is a big one in terms of their studio business versus their distribution platforms. And there's other examples. The independents, they're making shows, but they don't have the attached platform that they own as well. So if Miramax is making a show where I work right now, we can't just sell it to ourselves and say, well, we're gonna put it on our platform. I mean, interestingly, we're part of Paramount Global, so we have a relationship to them and their P Plus platform. But for the most part, companies like Sony, Warner Brothers was independent for many years before they actually combined with some of the other platforms that were out there. And so, it's a different dynamic at those places. And, the big thing to keep in mind is that, with Netflix and Amazon and Apple entering the industry in the last handful of years, it's really changed the leverage dynamic and what it means to work at these different places. It used to be that if you worked at NBC or CBS, ABC, those are the only places that could make a show, and they had tremendous leverage over the talent. When I went to go work at Universal Pictures, it was kind of a joke. Like, people would say, you're going to go work at a studio, and they'll give you the forms, the contracts with the terms that they'll agree to, and then they'll give you a give book, which lets you know what sort of changes you're allowed to make if people ask for them. And then you need to learn how to say no. And you stay within the lines, and you negotiate the terms, and you want consistency across all of your agreements as much as possible. Well, when Netflix and Amazon and Apple came in, right, they were hungry for content. They had tons of money to spend. They were competing, and it really changed the dynamics. The talent could start going to other places. They didn't need to go to NBC. They could get more money from elsewhere. So, this is kind of the big picture in terms of, how the system works. And of course, there are the digital creator studios and platforms that are out there as well that are completely changing the dynamic that's out there. And this presentation is going to be geared more towards the studio dynamic, but there's folks out there like Mr. Beast and the Try Guys, and they're producing tons of content for YouTube and TikTok. I mean, Mr. Beast is, I think, $100 million a year enterprise just himself, it sounds like. And interestingly, right, they cross over. So they might start, creating digital content and distributing on YouTube, but when they get large enough, somebody like Netflix pays attention, and then they want the Mr. Beast games, right? And it lets Mr. Beast now access a new infrastructure with greater financing available to produce these shows and have a broad global reach and to transcend the audience. So it really has changed a lot, the industry, and because of the entry of all these various streaming businesses. And of course, for a while, there was just this period of peak television where everybody knows there were so many shows being produced. And now that's kind of pulling back, right? And these companies are under greater pressure to report profits. And so, there's less television being made now. So when you're in an independent studio, it's getting harder to sell those shows in this environment. So going to sort of this slide, and the question then becomes, who are the stakeholders within the studio? Who are, as a business affairs executive, you working with to make your deals? Every project has a life cycle. And it starts with development, project goes into pre-production, then it's in production, and then it gets in post-production, and eventually it's distributed. And throughout this process, you're making deals and working with different folks to put together all the elements in order to get a show made, right? And so people think that when you're in-house, you just have one client, you work for NBC. But the reality is, you have many clients that you're working with internally. And they all have different interests and different motivations and perform a different function. So sort of just to kind of give you a sense of who these different stakeholders are, and think again of these folks as spokes on the wheel. Your creative executives are really at the heart of the creative process. They are the ones who are out there reading the books that are being published uh, and figuring out, would this be a great show? What does the market need right now, right? Is it the tween space where we want to find somebody? The studio executive might say, go find me my Game of Thrones. I need a show like that, right? So the creative executives are the ones who are working with you. They're working with the agents. They're working with all the managers that are out there, identifying what projects are available. They're reading the scripts. And then when they get to a point, they come to you and they say, look, we want to hire this writer to prepare a pilot script for us based on this book. We need you to make the deal to acquire the book or to hire the writer. And then they're your partner in the negotiation, right? What should we offer? What's a fair price for them? This is what they're asking for. This is what the issues are concerning their availability, etc. Right? Um, but they can't do it alone, right? They need somebody to work with to say, well, if this is what your script looks like, this is what the budget of the show is going to be. If it's 8 episodes and it's going to be set in San Francisco in the 50s and it's a period piece and we have to rent all the cars and all the costumes, this is what it's going to cost. These are your production executives, right? These are the people who put together the schedule and really handle the nuts and bolts of these shows and get things made. And sometimes, there can be a tension that's going on within a project. I mean, we've had situations where, the script is done, you're in production, and the showrunner has an idea that they want to maybe do a flashback to San Francisco in the 1950s. And somebody has to figure out like what's that going to cost and how is it going to affect our schedule and how are we going to pay for it? Is there room in the budget? And if there isn't room in the budget, you've got to go back to the platform that ordered the show. So maybe Netflix is paying for the show and you've got to go talk to them and say, this is what it's going to be. And the creative executives want to see this happen with the showrunner. How do we make it work? Right. And around and round, they all talk to each other. And in business affairs, you're at the hub of that, trying to figure out the path forward. Um, Casting executives work with all these teams to hire all the folks who are in the shows. They have their finger on the pulse of the market. They know who's available. They know what people's quotes are, and we'll talk more about that. They have their own relationships with agents and managers. They're involved in the pressure cooker when it comes to getting everybody cast in time to start principal photography, right? So they're another important stakeholder within the studio. There are finance executives that you work with all the time who are the ones who actually say, is it worth making the show? And where's the money going to come from? And how are we going to pay for it? And they work with the production folks about what the budget's going to be and where the tax credits are going to come from and when they are going to be received. Um, Business affairs, we've talked about. Legal affairs is really sort of your partner in crime when you're in business affairs. And a lot of times those two departments are combined. So at NBC, that, for example, they were separate for what I did. At Miramax, I handle both, right? So business affairs is negotiating the top level terms of these deals. And then legal affairs, when you have that hat on, you are papering the deals and you are handling the long form agreements and dealing with all the underlying rights issues and crossing all the T's, dotting all the I's, and dealing with the clearance issues. And can we use this in the show? What are the issues that we need to address with our marketing team? What are some of the distribution problems we may have? What are the guild issues we need to keep in mind, right? So all of this is part of the ecosystem that functions together. And then it all rolls up to the studio head, right? The Bella Bajarias and Netflix and Donna Langley at NBC and Bob Iger at Disney. For the most part, these people started as producers or creative executives themselves. And, they delegate and their job is to really, make sure that all the boats are going in the same direction at the same time. But when an issue is big enough, right? If it involves Tom Cruise's deal or some massive deviation from what your typical precedent is in the way that you do it, you know, it's a potential political issue, right? I mean, there was just this story about the South Park episode and the commentary, the political commentary, let's say, that was in the most recent episode, and how that rolled up to David Ellison, and was he aware of it? Was he not? At the end of the day, in business affairs, you might not be dealing with the studio head for most of the day to day, but there are definitely times where you've got to go and say there are bigger picture considerations here, right? And that's when things roll up to the studio head. So, again, it's managing stakeholders. In many ways, it's a lot like mediation, because you're working with all these different parties with diverse interests, and you're trying to bring them all together to collaborate. On the talent side, I'll sort of run through this a little bit more quickly, but these are who the folks are who you're making the deals with. Fundamentally, as a BA, what you're doing is you're hiring people and you're buying rights, right? So there's the authors who are writing the books that you're optioning, and the plays, and the podcasts, and the news articles. And there's an interesting dynamic with them, because right now people say in the industry IP is king, and authors are getting more for books than they ever have before. There was an agent I knew, and we were in a situation where multiple studios were competing for a project. And he was saying, I spent the last 20 years flying around the world, and maintaining my relationships with these authors, and we're finally getting paid, right? So, the leverage shifts in the industry as the focus on what people are looking for shifts. There's non-writing producers, they don't actually put pen to paper, but they put these shows together. They find the great books that are out there. They know the directors. They put them on projects. They package things up, and they try and find a studio to finance the project. The writer producers, in television, we call them the showrunners typically. These are the folks who are WGA members, and they're writing the scripts, right, for the pilot scripts for these shows, and they are managing the series from an episode to episode basis. And these are the folks you imagine, they're sitting in coffee shops and they're typing out scripts, and um, you know, fundamentally everything starts with a good script, right? You ask your actors and your directors, what they're looking for, and they want great writing. And there's this idea that, these people they seem like they're overnight successes, and they have a big show and they pop into the zeitgeist, but these people have been working on it for 20 years, putting in their time, developing their skill. And now, some of the royalty, like the Shonda Rhimes and the Dick Wolfs out there, they have these 9-figure deals, and Dick Wolf has, I think, 15 shows on the air, right? So they're tremendously important in the ecosystem. Directors, obviously, they're the driving force creatively, the visionaries. Directing a pilot episode is a huge deal, because you're really setting the tone for the rest of the entire series. In some sense, it's like directing a movie, right? And having a vision for what it's going to be. Performers, obviously, we know who they are. Um, not everybody's a star, right? There's day players, there's guest stars, there's a variety of different deals we negotiate based upon what someone's involvement is going to look like. And again, what's the leverage play here? A lot of it depends on timing and when you attach these people to a project. So if you're trying to put a project together and take it out the door from the studio to sell it to Netflix or Amazon, you want to put together all these different creative elements so you can go to them and say, look, here's this great package that we have. And it's often the directors and the performers especially who get these shows sold, right? You need a great script and concept, but when you know that, some A-list actor is going to be on the show, that makes a big difference. And oftentimes they're considered essential elements where they have to participate in order for the show to go forward. That's the type of leverage. And when they're in that situation, they're like, look, I'm not just a performer, but I'm a producer. I'm a big part of making this as well. Multi-hyphenates are folks who cross over, right? They're folks like Mindy Kaling and Lena Dunham and Tyler Perry. They're actors and writers and producers and directors in many cases. Digital creators we've talked about. And then there's sort of the unsung heroes, the department heads, the people who are the editors or the directors of, or the costume, the heads of the department for costuming or for uh, other areas as well. I mean, somebody like Guy Ritchie, for example, we've done some shows with him. He has a team that he works with on every production, right? And, if you hire him, well, you're going to hire his editor as well. So they're also a critical aspect of the process. And as a business first negotiator, you're dealing with different reps for all of these people. So, big picture wise, I think we all sort of know the image of the Ari Gold and the agent and the yelling, the screaming, but there might be an element of truth in some of these caricatures, but the situation is usually much more nuanced and complex. And you have to keep in mind that everybody who's listed on this slide, all these people have clients. They all work for commissions, and that's what these percentages are. in the industry, it's a bit of a zero-sum game, right? If you lose your client, they go to somebody else. Everyone's looking for the new folks. But losing a client is a big deal, right? Millions of dollars and careers are in the balance. One client can make an agent's career. Um, when it comes to agencies, we have the CAAs and the Endeavors, Gersh. These are your counterparts in a lot of these negotiations. They're licensed under the Talent Agencies Act. Their job is to procure employment for the talent, right? Quote unquote, procure employment. And obviously, there's different types of agents depending upon what the artist does. And some of these artists, they're involved in TV and film and digital and branding, and they have teams of agents who work for them. These are the guys who talk to your creative executives about the project. Who's available? Why is this person right for the project? So, a lot of them, they start out in the mail rooms and they pay their dues and they're hardworking folks. It's a tough business for them. Um, Personal managers work hand in hand with the agents. They really are there to manage the career of the artist. They don't really look for jobs, although that's sort of there's a fine line there in terms of what they do. But they're working hand in hand with these agents to to determine if the project is right for the artist and what they should be doing next and who they should work with. And the big difference is that managers are also can become producers on the projects that their clients work on. It's another great source of revenue for them, companies like Gotham Group and Anonymous Content and many others. And then of course, business managers, you don't really hear much about them, but a lot of these artists, they're enterprises themselves. A big performer or a writer, they'll have a production company. They might have, half a dozen projects they're working on that are in production at a time. They have development executives who work for them, right? Other people who work for them, assistants, they have staffs. They're buying houses, they're buying cars for their family, they're, renting jets, you name it, right? And so somebody has to make sure that the bills are getting paid and decide where the money should be invested. And that's where these managers come in. And then, of course, there are the entertainment lawyers. And really, the buck stops with them, right? From the studio perspective, as a BA or a legal, these are your primary counterparts when it comes to getting a deal closed. And, you know, they they offer tremendous value because they work with all of the studios and all of the talent, and they know what to ask for and what they can get. And fundamentally, they are the quarterback of this team. So it might be that the agents and the managers bring in the projects, but when it comes down to negotiating the deal and really getting into the weeds and making sure the artist is getting everything that they need, it's the lawyers who are really quarterbacking that process, like I said. Just quickly to talk about the guilds, I mean, and within this entire framework, right, there are guilds. So what we've been talking about today are scripted projects. We're not talking about unscripted projects and reality television like the Kardashians and for the most part animation. There's some exceptions, but we're talking about projects that are based upon scripts and use directing talent from the DGA. So big picture wise, I mean, these guilds, they establish scale and basic protections for all the artists and a framework that governs how everything works. For the kind of deals that I do and most, sort of higher level stuff in the studio, people aren't getting scale, right? They're getting way over scale. But fundamentally, when you're working with the production and casting, there's a range of people that you deal with. And you always have to keep in mind what these various frameworks and requirements are. You've seen with these strikes recently, they push legislative agendas, they get the big issues into the news, the AI issues that we've been dealing with, obviously. Um, there was a state bill that was just passed about using digital replicas. I think it's AB 2602 that they just passed, and it was signed at SAG headquarters. So and then on top of that, there's things like, IATSE, right? It's not just people who are the creative artists, but, there's people who drive the trucks and handle all the food services and are just critical to these performances who are unionized. And then, of course, at the theme parks, there's another dozen plus unions that are up there. And then there are foreign unions, right? So, the big picture is that you always have to keep in mind that the guild is out there and you need to be respectful and mindful of following the rules. And what you don't want is to be in a situation where the agents or the managers feel like you're doing something that's inappropriate and they tell their client to call the guild. And then the guild calls you and then you have a problem, right? Again, it goes back to relationships and building credibility over the long term. So that if there is an issue, if you did something wrong, if you made a mistake, if something got missed, then you can deal with it in good faith as opposed to having a really adversarial and contentious relationship with the guilds. So, sort of getting into more of the fine points of the negotiations, how do you know what to pay an actor, right? Or to pay for a script, or how much to pay to what to agree to if you're trying to sell your show to Netflix. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. There's a framework for each type of deal that I kind of talked about in terms of the key terms that are out there. And historically, the way this process worked is that an artist would have a precedent, right? What did you get paid on the last project? You would ask, what's the quote? And then the agent would tell you, right? And then it was not uncommon to pick up the phone and call the other studio that had hired the artist and confirm the quote and make sure that everything was consistent and comparable. And maybe you'd negotiate a bit of a raise if the last show was a success and their profile had increased. And that was the way things worked for a long time. But that changed in 2018 when the California legislature passed a law that said you can no longer ask for historical salary information when negotiating these types of deals. And the reason was because of pay disparity issues. And really, quotes were being used as a way to elevate certain people and hold other people back. So in 2018, Forbes reported that only 31% of the roles were out there for women, and 29% of the roles were being filled by underrepresented racial ethnic groups. And it had led to a pervasive compensation disparity where the world's 10 highest paid actors in 2018 were paid a total of $488,000 for the 10 highest paid male actors. The 10 highest paid female actors were paid a third of that, 172 million. So they were literally paying men 3 times more than women. So, and it was even worse for minorities, right? So, this law was passed in order to level the playing field so that you couldn't use somebody's quotes that was historically low to keep them down. Now things have changed, right? I mean, to some degree, you're still dealing with this system because if somebody has a great quote from another studio, they're going to tell you what it is, right? I mean, we have negotiations with high level talent, and we say to the lawyers, look, we can make an offer and propose something, and you can come back and let us know what you're looking for, but we don't want to be disrespectful. We appreciate that this is an experienced person and has an expectation about what the deal needs to look like structurally, and let's see if we can kind of cut to the chase and get a sense of where we should be. Um, some lawyers will tell you that this system has hurt clients because now studios have an incentive to just lowball it and say, well, you don't have a quote to support it. And if people don't offer a quote to say, well, look, I did get paid this, well, then they're asking for more than they got on the last deal, right? So it cuts both ways. And as a lawyer or a BA, what you're trying to do is find the middle point, right? You're trading numbers. Maybe you're hiring somebody to write a script and they want 500 and you're at 300 and you might want to get to 400, and you've got to go back and forth and find that middle point. And I think in some ways, the techniques we use are a lot like mediations, right? You make a soft offer. Well, I know I can get probably something with a 3 in front of it, but if I do that, or a 4 in front of it, but if I do that, I need to know that you're going to come down, right? And you go back and forth. And this is where trust and the relationship building is so important, right? Because you need to know that if you signal that you're going to get 400, you have to trust that they're going to take 400 and vice versa, because nobody wants to be burned. A lot of times you're trading horses. A lot of lawyers or BAs will hold on to different points. You exchange the same deal memo 6 times, and every time the studio says no, the lawyer comes back and says, well, I still need it. And at the end of the day, you may be down to 5 or 6 issues, and then you're trading horses, right? And you're saying, look, I can probably get you these 2 things, but I need to know if I get you these 2 things, you're going to drop these other 3 things. So again, it comes back to trust and the relationship in order to get past. And then sometimes you just do things that are crazy. You pay way more than you ever would for a book because it's a competitive situation or very unique circumstance. And then you say, well, the deal is non-precedential. So this way it can't come back and bite you and have that same lawyer you're dealing with on another show ask for the same thing. Talking about trust, I mean, this kind of goes to what we were just talking about, which is that, there is a bit of a perception out there potentially that agents and lawyers might not always tell the truth. I don't know if anybody has come across that in their careers professionally. It's negotiation, right? People are holding their cards close and they don't want to be the one who comes down and gets burned. There's always a question of when you can really be vulnerable and cut to your bottom line. And a lot of times there are things that you just can't do for the other side. Like I mentioned earlier, studios want consistency across their deals. They have internal policies. Sometimes you just have to get on the phone and say to the lawyer, like, I get where you're coming from. Right? Unfortunately, I just can't make the change to the language you're looking for. Or, but here's what I can do to help you feel comfortable. I know you're worried about this situation moving forward. Maybe it's that, you think that unless we commit to you to specifically say we're going to hire you for XYZ, if we have certain meetings with you involved, then we're going to drop your client. Well, I can tell you that's not what we do. We don't get into that in our contracts. We're at a short form stage, but I can send you an email that lets you know that this is what we would do moving forward to give you something to hold your hat on, right? Because fundamentally, nobody wants to get burned and people want to get the deal done. So, in terms of the techniques, and again, similar to I think what we do in mediations, you need to be able to acknowledge what someone else's concerns are. You need to be able to see what they're worried about and help them get comfortable. And with experience and seniority, you can kind of cut to the chase on a lot of these things, right? I mean, I've been in situations where the head of business affairs at one studio calls the head of business affairs at another studio. Maybe they've never even talked to each other, but they know all the same people and they know it's a high level client who's involved or high level issue. And one person says to the other, look, I mean, how do you want to do this? Do you want to do a little bit of a dance and go back and forth and pussyfoot around? Or do you want to kind of cut to the chase and I can tell you what's really going on over here and we can figure it out together and not waste everybody's time, right? Again, it's about trust, vulnerability, relationships, reputation. Sometimes these deals can be a real pressure cooker, right? And timing is everything because if you're about to go into principal photography and you need to close an actor's deal and they're going to start shooting on Monday and it's Thursday afternoon, you might be in a situation where the transactional lawyer says, well, I'm not going to let them get on the plane unless I get X, Y, Z, right? In that situation, you have very little leverage. You still have to figure it out. You're working with your stakeholders internally to let them know what you're dealing with and what has to be done, right? That can cut both ways. If you're casting a pilot or something like that and you have limited time in order to move forward, you can say from the studio side to the lawyer, look, I need to know by tomorrow if your guys willing to do this or not. This is what we can pay. This is what we have in the budget. We know he's great, but if he doesn't want to do it, we're gonna have to go find somebody else. We don't have time to wait, right? So that can go both ways. I mean, sometimes you're competing for a writer deal and you want to hire somebody because they're perfect for this show and this project. And the lawyer says, well, we're in the middle of a conversation with another studio about hiring them and they're willing to pay this and they want to close by Friday and they use time against you to force you to make more concessions and close the deal sooner. So at the end of the day, what your client internally is telling you from the studio executive side is just get it closed, right? You don't want a deal to take a long time to drag out, and then you're in a situation where the talent gets a better offer. And all of a sudden the agent says, well, sorry, now we're going to go do this instead, right? That's when like as the studio executive and BA, that's when you lose your job, right? So you don't want to be the person who's blowing up deals and losing them because things aren't happening fast enough. Um, again, you may have heard that people in the entertainment industry can have big egos, right? And as a business affairs executive, part of what you're doing is you're navigating how to manage that. And a lot of times you're in a situation like, for example, I've been in a situation recently where, you want to hire somebody who's a very high level writer, let's say, and they're used to receiving, they have a quote from another, prominent studio and they expect you to pay the same thing. And maybe they want, just $100,000 just to be a part of the project to get attached. And typically studios, if they're going to guarantee money, they guarantee it to actually write something, right? But sometimes you want to bring somebody into a project and say, if the show sells, then we'll hire you to write it. And so, these folks have big egos and they're used to getting a certain thing. And you're in the position of going back and saying, well, sorry, I can't pay you what you're looking for, right? And you're having that conversation with the agent or with the lawyer, and you're putting them in the uncomfortable position of going back to the client and saying, well, we got it for you over here, but we're not able to get it from Miramax, let's say, right? And how do you get past that situation, right? You have to massage the egos. You have to convey that you understand where the other side is coming from, right? You have to communicate what the problem is, why that money is not available, why we think that, for this project based on this intellectual property, that there's a lot of additional value we're offering to you. We're bringing a lot to the table here, so we know that you're used to getting certain things, but we're giving you something that's a great opportunity also, and we need some consideration for that, right? And then you have to be creative. Maybe you say, look, we can't do it for you up front, but we'll figure out a way to reward you in success. And so you're managing these egos internally and externally, right? It's not just the artists and the agents. You need to give them a win and to feel good about it, but you need to help your clients internally understand that sometimes you have to give, right? And if you're going to go hire somebody who's really famous and in demand, we may have to do some things that aren't as customary. Um, Another example, sometimes the hardest negotiations happen after the deal is closed, right? So I had a show. We had hired an actor to be in a prominent role. The show was in production. It's a $60 million budget. And, I think a month or so in or something like that, the actor had got an offer from, I think it was Marvel or someone, one of these big studios, to go and be in a superhero movie. And it's a potential 7-picture deal. And it's a huge career-changing opportunity for this artist. And of course, he wants to do it, but the problem is the schedules conflict, and they need him to show up on set 3 weeks later, and we have our schedule in place, and we're already spending the money on our show. And this artist, his agents want him to do it. He's got a new lawyer who didn't negotiate the deal with me, who's now trying to make this situation work, and he wants to have a win and get this situation resolved so the artist can do it. And usually what happens is the studios work it out between themselves and they say, all right, well, like, we'll let him go to your show. But if there's a problem, if he breaks his leg, if we have to stop production and he can't come back when he's supposed to come back a week later, then you have to indemnify us and you have to make sure that we're made whole because we're supposed to deliver a show to Netflix, 6 months from now. We have all these other things going on, other people we're paying. We can only hold them for so long. And we're not going to take that risk. If you want to take that risk, maybe we can figure it out. And the only reason we do it is because it's reciprocal, right? The studios need each other in these situations back and forth. Well, in this case, the studio wasn't willing to do it. They're sorry, it's just too much of a risk. We'll go find somebody else, right? And now the lawyer is up in arms. He's banging the table. He's trying to get it done, and we weren't willing to take that risk. Our creative executives wanted to make it work. The production people they'd move heaven and earth to make it work. But fundamentally, it rolls up to the studio head to say, hey, are we willing to take this risk for this piece of talent? Because he's important to us and we want to work with him, but there's a huge exposure. And, it wasn't Tom Cruise, right? So it was a situation where ultimately we had to say no. And the lawyer was so mad. He was saying, well, you can tell the studio head that this actor will never work for the company again. He will never be there. And I didn't take that message back because I liked the lawyer and I knew he was upset, and that's not productive, right? And at the end of the day, you say to these guys, look, I did the best we could. I'm sorry we couldn't connect. We'll do the best we can for him on something else. If there's a way to make it up to him, we will. We get it. We understand where you're coming from. And I want to say 6 months later, the same actor was cast in a really huge show within the studio with lots of other great talent. And it's an example of managing these egos, the ego of the lawyer, the ego of the people working within the studio, my own ego, right? And sort of, do I try and fight back with this guy and burn him? And 3 years later, however many years later now, he's my buddy and we work on deals together all the time. And so it comes back to this idea of there's an ecosystem and it's a long-term relationship that you're always working on. Another technique that we use is coalition building in chaos. And I know we're running short on time. And I want to leave some room for some questions. But again, within the studio, you're really in the middle as the business affairs executive of managing all these competing interests, right? And trying to get people to work together to figure out a solution. It's not just about dollars and cents. I had a situation where we were casting a show. There was an actress we wanted to hire. She had a quote of a couple $100,000 per episode. We were really short on time. She was perfect for the role. The money was in the budget, but the person who was over at the network who had to approve the decision thought it was too much to pay and didn't want to approve the $200,000 per episode, even though there was a quote. So now I got to go back to the agent and the lawyers and say, we get it. We understand there's a quote, but this person won't do it. And there can sometimes be internal political dynamics. Maybe this person was flexing their muscle a little bit. Maybe they wanted to get a win for this studio. Maybe they didn't care as much about the representatives. Meanwhile, your casting executive who wants to hire this person is steaming, right? And they have relationships and it should have closed and worked. And ultimately, there's this tension and you just want to be able to move forward and you don't have time. So, at the end of the day, it was a situation where, again, you're managing the egos and you're sort of letting everybody know we're doing the best we can. You're selling the agents and lawyers to say, look, I get it. Maybe it's less, but some time has passed and there's other value and it's a global platform and it's a fantastic role for her. And, we'll make sure to take care of her and you where we can, but this is the limit on what we can do. So, again, focusing on the relationship in the long term is always important in what we do. And I think with that, I will stop, other than to just say it's not always about money, right? I think some of these examples have demonstrated that, like a mediator would do in a case. You have to understand what's important to folks. Maybe they're trying to sell a book to the studio and it's a competitive situation where multiple studios want it. It may not just be about the money. It may be about their legacy. It may be about they want to work with a certain producer. It may be about there's a writer that your studio is working with and they have an authentic take on the work that really resonates with the author, right? It might be that their agent has a really great relationship with your client internally. So once again, we're always trying to understand what the real interests are that are motivating the negotiation and focus on them so we can get to a collaborative solution. Because fundamentally, everybody wants to work. We only can all win when something is actually getting made. And the big picture is critical to keep in mind. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that.
David, that's just fascinating. What a great inside look at the world of Hollywood deal making. In the minute or two we have left, can you dig down a little more in how to ferret out some of these underlying interests, the things that you may not have any clue when you walk in, and you hit an impasse and think, gee, I can't figure out what's really going on here. What are some techniques that you use to dig down and try to learn more?
Man, I think it comes back in some sense to the relationships and working with the team that you have, right? So, you're talking to your creative executives and they're talking to the other agents and the folks on the other side and they're having a different conversation. They might come to you and say, well, this is really what they want. They want to be able to write the script, or it's really important for them to be able to put this, it's a passion project. They want to do it in their schedule. So you work with book agents who are also having these conversations. And so there are all these conversations back and forth that are going on that you're using to obtain information, but you're also orchestrating them, right? So you might be in an impasse in your negotiation, and then you might say to your creative executive, why don't you go and have a conversation about this and let them know what's going on and see what they say. And you use that information to try and go back to the lawyer and see what you can negotiate.
So that in turn, David, means people have to trust you and confide in you. What are some of the things that you find effective in establishing trust quickly, as we have to do in mediations? People show up at 9 o'clock. Some of them we know, some of them maybe we don't. We want them all to trust us. What are some things you do to try to engender that?
I think you start every negotiation by trying to build rapport with the person on the other side, trying to understand who they are as a person. Maybe you have some overlap and commonality in terms of folks that you all know. I mean, you started out this morning by saying we both used to work at Altschuler, right? I have that type of conversation with people all the time. The other way that you engender trust is by how you choose the numbers, right? If you start off at some absurdly low number, like in a mediation, you can torpedo the negotiation right from the outset. You have to sort of demonstrate that you're acting in good faith. And the numbers that you choose and the terms that you offer from the outset are part of that. And also just talking and asking and sharing, right? Providing information to let them know what you're dealing with, what you're navigating, sort of being vulnerable, I think strategically, but being willing to do it. And if you get burned, you can always pull back, right? But I think It's not just at the beginning of the negotiation, but it's over the long term. So you say, oh, I just did a deal with such and such at your firm, right? You say that so that they can go talk to their colleague and they'll say, oh, Shraga's a decent person.
Got it. David, thank you so much. We're out of time. This has been a wonderful presentation. I think everybody can see why we're so happy David is part of the team here at the Will Work for Food Project. David, thank you so much. Jean, happy birthday. Enjoy the rest of the day. Natalie, thank you very much for everything you do to make the Will Work for Food Project New Possibilities Hour such a great success. Please contribute to the Sova Food Bank in Los Angeles if you're in a position to do so, or your local food bank if you wish. And then please do inform one of us of your contribution so that we can add it to our running total. Thanks so much to all of you. And with that, my friends, we are complete.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jeff.